"Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from that door." The sentence cut through the muted hum of the banking floor, and for a brief second the room felt smaller, as if the polished marble and glass walls had leaned inward to listen. Dr. Naomi Ellis did not move. Her hand rested lightly on the brushed steel handle of the conference suite, the one with the frosted panel that read, "Portfolio Risk, Authorized Access Only," and the late afternoon light from the tall Atlanta windows traced a faint reflection across her simple white blouse. It was 4:15 p.m. The wall-mounted clock above the concierge desk confirmed it with a steady, indifferent tick, and somewhere beyond that door, a team was preparing to finalize a $380 million underwriting agreement before the quarter closed at 5. Harold Pierce, the branch director, stood squared in front of her, his suit immaculate, his tie crisp, his expression that polite, managerial blend of patience and superiority. "This is a restricted area," he added in a tone that suggested explanation was a courtesy. "Our VIP clients are in session. If you're here to make a deposit, the teller line is on the other side of the lobby." He smiled, firm and dismissive, the kind of smile that closed conversations rather than opened them. Naomi's posture remained calm. She carried no designer handbag, no polished briefcase, only a small charcoal laptop sleeve tucked beneath her arm, her hair pulled back neatly, her sneakers gray from use rather than style. A handful of people nearby began to notice. A middle-aged couple seated in the waiting alcove exchanged glances. A young associate in a slim-fit suit slowed his steps and pretended to read his tablet while watching from the corner of his eye. A woman in a navy blazer, Lily Hartman, hovered behind the reception desk, fingers poised over the keyboard, her glance rising and falling in anxious alignment with Harold's voice. The bank's air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and expensive promises. Naomi spoke softly, as if measuring each word against the noise of the room. "I have a scheduled appointment in that room," she said. "My name is Dr. Naomi Ellis." Her voice held no edge, no urgency, just steadiness. Harold exhaled through his nose, a sound like tolerance wearing thin. "Appointments for that conference suite are limited to principal signatories and their registered counsel," he replied, "and we have verified everyone who belongs inside." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice, but not enough to lose his audience. "We can't have unauthorized observers near a confidential financial execution. I'm sure you understand." Naomi glanced at the clock again. 4:16 p.m. 44 minutes before the deadline stamped on an internal memo she had read that morning. 44 minutes before decisions made in that room would become permanent. "There's a document associated with today's session," she said quietly. "Risk Review Addendum 19B. I'm here regarding that." The young associate's eyebrows lifted. Lily shifted in place. Harold's jaw flexed, irritation flickering across his face like a light briefly dimming. "I don't know what you think you're referring to," he said, louder this time, "but this is not the place to test procedural theories you found on the internet. I'm going to ask you again. Please step aside." The room cooled. Conversations slowed. Two clients waiting near the glass railing angled themselves for a better view. A man in a tailored charcoal suit, possibly legal counsel, possibly curiosity with a briefcase, watched without blinking. The moment gathered weight, the invisible kind that settles on a person's shoulders when the world decides who they are before they speak. For a heartbeat, Naomi said nothing. She had learned over years of professional scrutiny that silence was a tool. Sometimes it revealed truth faster than confrontation ever could. Harold interpreted it as reluctance. "Ma'am," he continued sharper now, "we pride ourselves on maintaining a high-security environment for serious financial matters. If you don't have business here, I will have security escort you to the lobby entrance." The phrase didn't quite sound like protection. It sounded like removal, like exclusion dressed in policy. Lily spoke up softly. "Harold, there is an appointment request under that name in the system, but—" She hesitated, eyes sliding from screen to face, from face back to screen. "It's marked provisional." Harold's lips curled into a satisfied line. "Exactly," he said. "Provisional is not authorized. People submit all kinds of inquiries when they don't understand how our tiered access works." Naomi met Lily's eyes, then Harold's. "I understand tiered access," she replied, and I understand procedures that were meant to protect risk, not to filter people based on how they appear when they walk in the door. A few breaths caught in the air. The young associate shifted his weight. Someone's phone tilted upward. Not quite filming. Not quite not filming. 4:17 p.m. The seconds marched forward, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. Harold's tone hardened. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, voice resonant across the vaulted ceiling. "This institution handles multi-hundred-million-dollar instruments. We don't approve entry based on claims or confidence. We approve entry based on credentials that match expectations. Right now, nothing about this situation matches mine." Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her laptop sleeve, then relaxed again. The memory of her mother's hand, warm, frail, steady on her wrist earlier that afternoon in a quiet hospital room, passed through her mind like a breath she did not exhale. She had changed clothes in the car, washed her face in the restroom downstairs, walked upstairs without announcement because the assignment required discretion. Not invisibility. Discretion. "I'm not asking you to bend rules," she said gently. "I'm asking you to read them." A murmur stirred from the seating alcove. The man in charcoal suit lowered his phone to his lap, but did not stop watching. The tension in the room was no longer an accident. It had become a presence, a silent witness. Lily swallowed. "Harold, do you want me to check section 7.4 ? It's flagged in the review queue." "No," he snapped, then softened his tone for show. "We are not delaying a critical execution because someone wandered into the wrong wing of the building." He turned back to Naomi, eyes cool, posture fixed. "I'm asking you for the last time. Step away from that door." Naomi inhaled slowly. Her heartbeat did not quicken. Her voice did not rise. When she finally spoke, it was almost a whisper, and yet the entire banking floor seemed to hear it. "If you believe dignity should not depend on clothing or assumptions," as she said, "and that procedures should protect truth, not prejudice, then remember this moment. Now, let's go back to where this truly began." She removed her hand from the door handle, not in surrender, but in patience, and the clock above them continued its steady, indifferent march toward 5 o'clock. At 3:42 p.m., nearly half an hour before she stood at that frosted glass door, with the weight of other people's certainty pressing against her, Dr. Naomi Ellis had been seated in a quiet corner of St. Andrew's Medical Pavilion, the kind of corridor where time moved differently, where voices softened out of instinct rather than instruction, and where her mother, Evelyn Ellis, rested with a blanket tucked beneath her chin and a distant jazz melody whispering from an old portable radio. Hospitals had their own kind of clock, Naomi had always thought, not the relentless march of minutes across a digital display, but the deeper, slower measure of waiting, of breaths counted, of prayers whispered into sterile ceilings. She had held her mother's hand, feeling the faint tremor in her fingers, remembering a childhood lecture delivered in that same gentle cadence. Dignity is not a costume, baby. It is a discipline. You carry it whether people see it or not. When the nurse stepped in to adjust the monitor and smiled warmly at Naomi, she returned the smile, then checked the notification that glowed quietly across her phone screen. Internal alert, review marker, Addendum 19B escalated for risk assessment prior to execution, and a small knot tightened beneath her ribs. The assignment had been accepted 2 weeks earlier through a discreet, independent consultancy channel, the kind that handled sensitive compliance questions quietly, the kind that asked for silence until evidence spoke clearly enough to stand on its own. She had agreed because patterns mattered, because her work had shown, again and again, that the smallest choices made by people in positions of perceived authority had a way of revealing much larger truths about systems. The email that first requested her evaluation had been cautious in tone, but unmistakable in implication. Inconsistent treatment between client tiers, variance in procedural enforcement correlated suspiciously with surface-level judgments, and a flagged internal memo suggesting that certain risk checks were being bypassed under the assumption that VIP relationships reduce practical exposure. The language had been polished, corporate, careful, but beneath it she recognized something older and heavier, something she had seen in hospitals and boardrooms and school offices, something that spoke in the quiet vocabulary of doors opening for some and closing for others. She had closed the email, breathed once, and said yes. It wasn't heroism. It was work. It was discipline. It was a promise she had made to herself years ago, that analysis could be a form of care when used to protect people who were treated as afterthoughts in rooms where decisions carried consequences. At 3:47 p.m., she whispered goodbye to her mother, adjusted the blanket one more time, and stepped into the restroom, where fluorescent lights cast a clean, unflattering glow over the mirror. She removed the blazer she'd worn earlier in the week for a corporate briefing, folded it into the back seat of her car, and replaced it with a simple white blouse, the kind she preferred when long days demanded comfort over presentation. She tied her hair back. She washed her hands. She breathed. She did not disguise herself. She simply did not decorate herself for someone else's expectations. The drive downtown was quiet, the rhythm of tires on asphalt underscoring the memory of one particular case years earlier, when a community hospital had nearly collapsed under the weight of 3 class action suits. Not out of malice, but out of habit, out of routines that treated some families as worth waiting for and others as less urgent. She had helped them change that, not by humiliation, not by threat, but by showing them their own reflection in data they could no longer deny. She had learned in those months that reform didn't start with outrage. It started with accuracy. The Addendum 19B that glowed at the edge of her phone was part of that same lineage, a compact file with a trail of small discrepancies, time-stamped steps in a workflow where expedience had slowly replaced compliance. A few approvals cleared without full verification, a few exceptions granted because the client was high value. A pattern subtle enough to pass for efficiency, unless you knew how to read the shape of its shadow. She had downloaded the encrypted packet that morning, read it twice, then once more with coffee she never finished. The seed of truth was already there, not dramatic, not loud, not cinematic, just quiet and undeniable. A single-line entry had stood out. Procedural deviations occurred primarily during interactions where staff perceived the presenting client as non-essential, low impact, or unlikely to escalate complaint. Naomi knew those words without needing them spelled out. She had lived them. She had seen them dressed in politeness, in policy language, in the thin smile of professionals who believed they were only maintaining standards. She had also learned, painfully, patiently, that understanding a problem from the outside was not the same as witnessing it from within. That was why she was asked to arrive without announcement. That was why her name had been entered into the system as provisional. She was there as a mirror, not as a symbol. At 3:58 p.m., she pulled into the underground garage, the echo of her footsteps rising softly between concrete pillars. Her laptop sleeve balanced beneath her arm, her notes memorized rather than carried in stacks of paper, she moved through the lobby unnoticed, blending into that invisible category of people assumed to be passing through rather than arriving with purpose. She saw it in the way the receptionist's glance slid over her and returned to the man in the dark tailored suit behind her. She felt it in the way an usher nodded absently instead of asking if she needed assistance. It was familiar, not surprising, not shocking. Familiar. And somewhere beneath the calm surface of her breathing, the seed of Addendum 19B settled into place. She paused near the glass railing overlooking the lower atrium, studying the patterns of movement, the tiny hierarchies written into posture and tone. Compliance wasn't only about forms and approvals, it was about culture. It was about who was trusted without question, and who was asked to explain themselves a second time. At 4:06 p.m., she had already confirmed what she needed to test. The provisional flag had triggered a subtle tightening of tone, a microsecond of skepticism at Lily's workstation, then a silent exchange of glances between colleagues who assumed not priority. Naomi did not take offense. She took note. She watched the clock. She listened to the muted preparation inside the conference suite. Paper shuffled, voices softened, confidence rehearsed. She knew the deal inside that room could proceed safely if protocols were honored. She also knew that pressure had a way of convincing people that rules were optional when the person waiting outside did not fit their picture of consequence. So she did the simplest thing she could do, the most revealing thing. She stepped to the door, rested her hand on the handle, and asked to be allowed where her mandate said she belonged. What followed was not surprising. It was predictable enough to feel scripted by years of repetition. Doubt framed as caution, security framed as exclusion, kindness used as a cushion for dismissal. And yet, as Harold's voice hardened and Lily's uncertainty flickered across her face, Naomi did not feel anger. She felt distance, the slow, familiar ache of watching a system display itself without realizing it was on display. The seed of Addendum 19B pulsed quietly beneath the scene, like a signal waiting for response, reminding her of why she was there and what she could not allow to be buried beneath someone else's confidence. At 4:15 p.m., the clock pronounced its steady judgment across the banking floor. The countdown had begun. The room had chosen its assumptions. And Naomi, carrying her mother's voice like a thread through the noise, dignity as a discipline, prepared not to argue, but to wait, to watch, and to let the truth reveal itself at precisely the moment when it could no longer be ignored. The first escalation arrived without raised voices, the way a temperature rises in a room before anyone admits it is getting warm, and it began with a discreet motion of Harold's hand toward the security desk, a small signal that carried an outsized certainty about where authority belonged and who needed to be reminded of it. Marcus, the security supervisor in a navy blazer with a gold badge stitched neatly above his pocket, approached with the quiet professionalism of someone accustomed to being summoned to restore order without ever being told what order meant. "Is there a problem here?" he asked not unkindly, and Harold answered before Naomi could speak, framing the narrative in a tone that sounded rehearsed from long habit. A potential disruption near a confidential session, an individual with unclear credentials, time-sensitive work that could not be jeopardized. The words fell into place like a policy template, and the people nearby absorbed them the way crowds absorb headlines, filling in the blanks according to their own expectations. Naomi met Marcus's eyes, not confrontational, simply present. "My name is Dr. Naomi Ellis," she said, the same sentence she had offered moments earlier, as consistent as breath. "I am here regarding risk review, Addendum 19B. The young associate near the railing shifted again, the faintest ripple of recognition passing through his expression, as if that number tugged at a loose thread of memory. Lily's fingers hovered above her keyboard, then tapped tentatively as she navigated the internal portal, her brow knitting when the screen flashed its amber banner. Pending review, elevated visibility. A phrase that she had seen before and dismissed the way one dismisses clouds on a busy morning. Harold's voice cut across the moment with courteous finality. "Dr. Ellis, we cannot allow unrelated observers inside a high-value execution. If you need to file a concern, you may do so after the signing." The subtext was unmistakable. This room at this time for these people. Everyone else could wait. Naomi did not push. She simply asked in that same even tone whether Section 7.4 of procedural verification had been completed for the transaction scheduled at 5 p.m., and whether the dual control attestation had been documented according to policy. The question changed the air. It was not dramatic. It was specific. Harold stiffened, his confidence reassembling itself with visible effort. "Our internal processes are not subject to on-the-spot interrogation," he replied, and the phrasing, "not subject," settled into the silence, like a small stone dropped into still water. The man in the charcoal suit leaned slightly forward, curiosity sharpening into attention. A college-aged client sitting with his mother by the window murmured something under his breath, then lifted his phone higher, the lens angled in that cautious half-tilt people use when they are not sure whether they are allowed to remember what they are witnessing. 4:32 p.m. The clock's thin red second hand cut across the circle of numbers like a steady blade, each sweep shrinking the distance between assumption and consequence. Marcus cleared his throat. "Harold, if there's a flagged addendum associated with the execution, perhaps we should—" Harold cut him off with a smile, just polite enough to pass as collegial. "This is not a security issue. It is an access issue, and access has already been determined." His tone was smooth, but something behind it wobbled, a tremor of unease that only those attuned to such tremors could hear. Naomi felt it, not as triumph, but as confirmation, the subtle narrowing of perspective that occurred when procedure was used less as a guide and more as a gate. She thought of the hospital case years ago where a single intake form had quietly sorted families into urgency or delay based on what someone behind a desk believed they could navigate without complaint. The patterns changed context but not behaviors. Lily hesitated, then spoke more firmly than before. Harold, the addendum is linked to this docket. It says preliminary risk alignment pending. It also says must validate under dual control if escalated. Her voice wavered on the last word, not because she doubted the text, but because she sensed what it implied. That something might not be as complete as everyone had been assuring one another it was. Harold's reply came slower this time. "We have VIP expectations to meet," he said, and the phrase landed in the room with a weight that Naomi had come to recognize. The invisible hierarchy of who warranted patience, who warranted precision, and who did not. A middle-aged woman with silver hair and a pearl brooch raised her head from the magazine in her lap and watched Harold, with a look Naomi had seen on elders in church pews, not confrontational, but disappointed. "I'm sure the bank can meet expectations and follow its own rules at the same time," the woman said gently, and for a fraction of a second, a hush moved through the space like a shared intake of breath. Harold's jaw tightened. "Madame, we are handling this internally." The words were polite, but they shortened the space between people. Marcus looked again at Naomi, then at the door, and something in his posture shifted. "If there is a dual control requirement tied to this addendum," he said carefully, "and we're inside the execution window, I would feel more comfortable confirming the status." It was neither rebellion nor defiance. It was caution, the protective instinct of someone who had learned that the cost of overlooking small details rarely fell on the people who overlooked them. Harold's smile thinned. "We are not reopening our process 30 minutes before signing because a provisional entry decided to test our system." His words were softer than the feeling beneath them. A young teller standing near the vestibule lowered her eyes to hide the flicker of discomfort that crossed her face. Naomi did not look at Harold now. She looked at Lily. "Would you show me the timestamp on the last validation step?" she asked. "I won't touch your screen. Just read it aloud." Lily hesitated, then whispered, 4:03 p.m. Pre-clearance. 1 of 2 approvals logged. 1 of 2. The words hovered in the air like a thin thread holding a great weight. Naomi nodded once, as if acknowledging that gravity behaved exactly as expected. "Then Section 7.4 has not yet been completed," she said, not accusatory, simply factual. The associate near the railing exhaled sharply. The man in the charcoal suit closed his briefcase halfway, as if uncertain whether his role today was to observe or to prepare to intervene. 4:36 p.m. The seconds pressed forward, indifferent. Harold straightened his shoulders. "Miss Hartman will complete the documentation shortly," he said, but the sentence belonged more to hope than to record. The pearl brooch woman spoke again, quieter now. "If a system leaves room for skipping a step when someone seems unimportant, that step isn't just procedural, it's moral." She glanced apologetically at Naomi, not as if she pitied her, but as if she regretted the familiarity of the script they were all watching unfold. Harold's patience snapped in a subtle way, the kind of snap that cannot be replayed on camera but can be felt even by those who have never known its language. "Marcus," he said, "please escort Dr. Ellis to the lobby seating area until this matter concludes." Marcus did not move right away. He looked at Naomi, then at the clock, then at Lily's trembling cursor on the half-completed attestation line. "Before I do that," he said, his voice firming into something steadier than deference, "I'd like to understand why a pending review marker was ignored for over an hour." The question rippled outward. Someone inhaled sharply near the window. A teenager whispered to his mother, "They skipped something," in that hushed, odd tone reserved for moments when the adult world reveals its faults by accident. Naomi felt no vindication, only inevitability. This was escalation not by argument, but by gravity, when truth reaches a point where silence can no longer hold it in place. Harold's face reddened, then paled. "This is not a tribunal," he said. "This is a bank." Naomi's reply was simple. "Yes," she said softly, "which is why what happens in this room should not depend on who is standing at the door." 4:39 p.m., 21 minutes to 5. The room was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that makes every breath sound like confession. The lowest point did not arrive with a crash. It arrived with a soft administrative click, the way doors close in quiet hallways when no one is watching, and Harold's decision unfolded not as anger, but as policy, spoken with finality. "For the integrity of this execution," he announced, each syllable polished, "I am temporarily suspending peripheral system access and sealing the review queue until after signing." The words sounded reasonable, technical, almost responsible, yet they moved through the room like a curtain drawn across a window just as light tries to enter. Lily's screen dimmed, the amber banner disappeared, and a notice appeared that read, "Restricted pending managerial override." The digital equivalent of pretending uncertainty did not exist. Marcus's jaw tightened. He shifted his stance slightly, as if balancing the weight of something he could not name aloud. The young associate near the railing lowered his eyes and whispered, barely audible, "They locked the queue," with the soft disbelief of someone realizing a story he once defended had just contradicted itself. Harold turned toward Naomi, his tone gentle enough to pass for courtesy. "Doctor." "Ellis," he said, "while I appreciate your interest in our processes, your presence is now interfering with time-sensitive obligations to our clients. Please wait in the outer lobby." His words were calm, but the message beneath them was older than policy. Naomi nodded once, slowly, and withdrew her hand from the line of sight between Lily's monitor and the air that surrounded it. She did not argue. She did not plead. She did not remind anyone of the addendum, or the dual control language, or the reason her name existed in their system at all. She stepped aside in the way the world expected her to step aside, and the room relaxed a fraction, the way people relax when they think a complication has finally agreed to become invisible. 4:41 p.m., 19 minutes to 5. The ticking of the clock felt louder even though it had not changed volume. She walked toward the seating alcove near the glass railing, her footsteps unhurried, her face composed, and the man in the charcoal suit watched her pass with a look that hovered between apology and respect. The pearl brooch woman folded her magazine, as if to honor the gravity of what was happening by refusing to pretend she was reading. Naomi sat, placing her laptop sleeve gently on her knees, and in the silence around her she could feel the narrative reshaping itself, not by truth but by proximity. The room perceived herself and Harold as separate categories of consequence, and categories have a way of deciding outcomes before evidence ever arrives. Through the frosted glass, muted silhouettes shifted across the conference table as the deal team prepared documents for signatures. Pens were uncapped, pages straightened, voices softened into the confident cadence of people accustomed to being trusted. The sealed review queue flickered through Naomi's mind, not as a defeat, but as a map of what pressure chooses to ignore. She thought of Evelyn's hands, years ago, guiding her through the slow discipline of patience. Some truths do not shout, Naomi. They wait until the room has no choice but to hear them. Marcus approached the alcove, his steps slower than before, his voice low. "For what it's worth," he murmured, "I didn't feel right about locking that queue." He did not justify himself. He did not offer excuses. He simply acknowledged the discomfort of complicity. Naomi looked at him, not as ally or opponent, but as another person caught between habit and conscience. "Discomfort can be a signal," she said gently. "The question is whether a system listens to it." He nodded, then returned to his post, shoulders squared against an unease that would not leave him. Inside the room, Lily's cursor hovered over the attestation field, her hand trembling slightly as she prepared to finalize a step she could no longer see the full shape of. Harold stood at the head of the table, voice warm, posture confident, narrating the sequence of signatures with a composure that sounded almost rehearsed. Language about timeliness, about opportunity, about trust built over years. But beneath that composure, a fissure widened, because once you have seen the seam where certainty bends, you cannot unsee it. 4:46 p.m., 14 minutes to 5. The young associate drifted nearer the alcove under the pretense of adjusting a floor directory. His face was pale. "Ma'am," he whispered without looking directly at Naomi. "Earlier today, the system flagged 2 workflows tied to Addendum 19B. They were supposed to be reviewed before any further approvals." He swallowed, guilt pulling his words inward. "Somebody cleared the first one to move things along." He spoke not like someone betraying a company, but like someone confessing to gravity. Naomi did not ask names. She did not ask motives. She asked only one question. What did the second workflow involve? He hesitated. Client risk parity checks, he said. Ensuring procedures are applied consistently across tiers. The phrase settled like a weight on the table behind the frosted glass, even though no one in that room could hear it. Naomi absorbed the information without visible reaction, though inside her chest a quiet, steady line of thought connected decades of small moments. Doors not opened, voices not believed, policies recited like scripts meant to protect order rather than people. Through the glass, Lily lifted her pen. Harold smiled. Their silhouettes leaned over the page where ink was meant to become permanence. 4:49 p.m., 11 minutes to 5. The teenager by the window lifted his phone again, not for spectacle but for record, and his mother placed a hand on his arm as if to say, be respectful, but don't look away. The pearl brooch woman folded her hands in prayer, not because she was religious, but because some silences require reverence. Naomi closed her eyes for a single breath. She did not rehearse speeches. She did not imagine confrontation. She reviewed the policy language she knew by heart, the clause that defined dual control not as suggestion, but as safeguard, the clause that described attestation as evidence not of convenience, but of integrity. She waited, not for permission, but for the moment when truth and time would intersect. The moment arrived like the faintest tremor in the air. A muffled exchange rippled through the conference room, barely audible beyond the glass. A chair scraped. A page turned in confusion. Lily's voice rising just enough to carry through the gap beneath the door. Harold, the second approval isn't logged. Silence followed. Not the silence of calm, but the silence of impact. As if the room itself had hit something solid it didn't know was in its path. Naomi did not move. She did not stand. She let the silence do its work. Marcus looked up sharply. The young associate closed his eyes because the truth had finally surfaced in a space where it could no longer be dismissed as theory. Harold's silhouette stiffened, hand hovering above the paper, then dropping slowly to the table. Even from the alcove, Naomi could sense the shift, authority faltering in the presence of its own reflection. 4:52 p.m., 8 minutes to 5. The deal team whispered among themselves, urgency now edged with unease, and the locked review queue, the one sealed moments earlier to protect momentum, suddenly mattered more than the signatures waiting for ink. Harold's voice came through the door, lower, strained. Reopen the queue. The words carried no triumph for Naomi. They carried necessity. Lily's hands shook as she tried to navigate permissions, only to realize she no longer had access to the very safeguard the process depended on. And for one fragile instant, everyone in that room confronted the cost of treating protocol as optional when applied to those who seemed less consequential. Naomi opened her eyes. The lowest point was not about humiliation. It was about recognition. The painful, undeniable recognition that a system built to protect truth had nearly silenced it because of who happened to be standing outside the door. The clock continued its unhurried march toward 5, and somewhere inside the room, the seed of Addendum 19B finally began to take root. The reveal did not erupt. It unfolded with the steady precision of a hinge finally aligning with the weight it had been built to carry. And when Lily's trembling attempt to reopen the sealed queue failed a second time, Harold stepped into the corridor with an urgency that no longer resembled confidence. His polished shoes clicked softly against the marble as he approached Marcus and spoke in a low, taut voice that nevertheless carried to the seating alcove. "We need administrative clearance," he said, and there was no veneer on the words now. No performance, no theater. Only the quiet recognition that the process he had treated as optional was, in fact, the only thing capable of protecting the deal he valued so fiercely. Marcus's brow furrowed. "Administrative clearance requires dual control confirmation," he replied, "which we don't have." It was not accusation. It was architecture. Naomi rose slowly from her seat, not with drama, not to claim the moment, but because the intersection had arrived, the precise place where truth could finally stand without asking permission. She did not raise her voice. Section 7.4 requires a verifier independent of the execution chain, she said, and even the teenager by the window lowered his phone out of respect, as if instinctively sensing the gravity of what was being spoken into the room. Harold turned toward her, his expression suspended somewhere between defensiveness and something far more fragile, awareness. "This isn't the time for procedural lectures," he murmured, but the words had lost their footing. Naomi held his gaze with a calmness that was not challenge, only steadiness. "This isn't a lecture," she said. "It's the language your bank wrote to keep truth from depending on convenience. 4:54 p.m. 6 minutes to 5. The conference room door eased open and Lily stepped into the hall with the color drained from her cheeks and a stack of unsigned documents pressed against her chest, as if paper could anchor a situation that was slipping toward honesty. "The system says escalation required," she whispered, and the phrase sounded less like a notification than a confession. Harold swallowed, then addressed Marcus with a formality that had finally turned inward. "Escort Dr. Ellis back to the threshold," he said, and though it could have been interpreted as assertive, the intention beneath it had shifted, not to remove her, but to face what could no longer be denied. Naomi returned to the doorway, the glass at her shoulder shimmering faintly with reflections of the city evening creeping in from the tall windows. She did not step inside. She did not cross lines she did not need to cross. Authority did not require intrusion. It required clarity. "Before we proceed," Marcus said, voice level, "we need to know who you are in relation to this process." The question arrived not as resistance but as an opening, and Naomi nodded once, the gesture small, almost reverent, as if acknowledging that identity was not a weapon, but a responsibility. She opened her laptop sleeve and withdrew a thin, matte folder, stamped with a simple emblem, no flamboyance, no theatrics, and placed it gently on the small side console beneath the conference suite sign. "Independent Compliance Auditor," she said softly. "Retained by your Regional Oversight Council to evaluate the application of procedural parity across execution environments." Lily blinked. The young associate covered his mouth. Harold's breath halted for a fraction of a second, because the language she used was unmistakable. Not the vocabulary of complaint, but of mandate. Naomi lifted a second page, clean, uncreased, and read a line that did not need emphasis because its weight carried itself. "Authority to intervene when the absence of dual control creates potential material exposure." The pearl brooch woman closed her eyes as if offering a silent amen. Marcus straightened, not out of submission but out of alignment, as if the floor had finally leveled beneath his feet. "Credentials confirmed," he said after reviewing the embossed seal and tracing the authorization code with his thumb, as though touching the truth with his hands would make it more real. The air changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but irrevocably. Harold stepped aside from the table with a careful movement that looked less like defeat and more like a long-delayed acknowledgement of the space he had taken for granted. "What do you recommend?" he asked, the question stripped of every layer of pride until only responsibility remained. Naomi did not linger in triumph, because there was none to take. There was only work. "Reopen the review queue under dual control," she replied. "Verify the parity workflows across tiers, not just the VIP ledger. Validate whether the protocol that protects less visible clients was applied here with the same discipline you reserve for those you consider consequential." Lily nodded, fingers steadying as she entered the override path, with Marcus standing beside her, not guarding her, not supervising her, but witnessing a process being returned to the purpose it was created for. The queue unlocked with a silent line of text that flickered across the screen, and in that tiny pulse of light, the room saw itself more clearly than any speech could have forced it to see. 2 workflows incomplete, one bypassed for speed, another postponed because the person whose file triggered it did not fit the room's imagination of risk. Naomi spoke softly. "Exposure doesn't begin with fraud. It begins with inconsistency." She turned the laptop toward Harold then, not to humiliate him, not to corner him, but to show him something without commentary. A simple comparative chart she had constructed that morning. Patterns of approvals mapped against patterns of perception, a quiet constellation of decisions that treated some steps as essential and others as optional, depending on who was standing in front of the desk. Harold's shoulders sagged, not theatrically, not for sympathy, but because the data had removed the last refuge of denial. If we sign now, Marcus said slowly, each word measured with the precision of a man who understood consequence. It isn't only a legal risk, it's a moral one. 4:57 p.m., 3 minutes to 5. The conference team watched from behind the glass, no longer impatient, no longer incredulous, but suspended in a sober stillness that carried the weight of decisions they would remember long after numbers faded from screens. Naomi did not instruct them. She read instead, quietly, from the clause the institution had once written to honor the best version of itself. Dual control ensures that no single person's judgment determines whose rights deserve precision. And then she stopped speaking because the line did not require embellishment. It required obedience. Harold inhaled deeply, then turned to Lily. "Suspend execution," he said, the words neither heroic nor humiliating. "Simply necessary. Reopen full validation." Lily clicked the command with gratitude disguised as professionalism, and the second hand on the clock reached its next marker with a softness that sounded almost like relief. No applause broke out. No accusations flew. The teenager lowered his phone and held it against his chest. The pearl brooch woman exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The man in the charcoal suit nodded once, as if to say this is what leadership should look like when it finally remembers itself. Harold looked at Naomi, eyes no longer defensive, only tired. "You didn't come here to stop a deal," he said. Naomi shook her head gently. "I came here to protect the truth beneath it." And in that quiet, the room, for the first time all afternoon, felt steady. Not victorious, not defeated, steady. The deal would be reviewed, not erased. The signatures would wait, not vanish. But the larger signature, the one written invisibly into the culture of the bank, had already begun to change, one disciplined decision at a time, under the silent authority of a process that had finally done what it was meant to do. In the hours that followed, the building did not feel like a battlefield that had chosen a victor. It felt like a house that had been asked, gently but firmly, to look at itself in a mirror for the first time in years. And as dusk slipped through the tall windows and painted the marble floors in shades of amber and blue, the hurried cadence of the afternoon slowed into something quieter, more deliberate, almost reverent. The conference documents lay neatly stacked on the center table, unsigned but unabandoned, waiting not as an opportunity denied, but as a future postponed until it could stand on steadier ground. Harold remained near the head of the table. His posture changed in a way that could not be measured by inches, not slumped, not broken, simply honest, as if a long tension he had carried in his shoulders for years had finally admitted its own existence. Lily stood to his left, sleeves rolled to her elbows now. No longer trembling, her voice steadier with each verification she read aloud, and Marcus hovered at the threshold, neither guard nor spectator, but a witness to a culture shifting one line item at a time. Naomi did not linger in the center of attention. She stepped aside once the override had been completed, and the parity checks reopened, allowing the team to do their work without the shadow of spectacle. She spoke only when asked, answered only what mattered, and let silence do most of the teaching. 6:12 p.m. glowed softly from the clock now, long past the hour when the deal had first been scheduled to close, and yet there was no sense of failure in the room. There was relief, the quiet kind that settles into the body when something damaging has been averted not by force, but by restraint. The young associate who had whispered earlier approached Naomi with a hesitance that resembled humility rather than fear. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low as if gratitude itself needed to be spoken gently in such a space. "For not humiliating anyone." Naomi offered a small, warm smile. "Accountability isn't humiliation," she replied softly. "It's instruction." His eyes moistened just a little, not with drama, but with the dawning understanding that he had witnessed something that would shape the way he worked, and the way he treated people, for the rest of his career. In the waiting alcove, the pearl brooch woman stood, smoothing the fabric of her coat with hands that trembled not from age, but from emotion. She approached Naomi with the careful grace of someone raised to respect both silence and truth. "I have lived long enough," she said gently, "to know that change almost never happens in a shout. It happens in a room like this, when someone refuses to disappear." Naomi bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement, not accepting praise, only sharing the weight of it. Harold took a slow breath and stepped away from the table. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the polished certainty that had filled it earlier, only sincerity. "I spent years telling myself that efficiency was a virtue," he said, the confession halting but unforced. "I never asked who it served." Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the sentence exist between them. Let it breathe. Let it reveal itself not as guilt, but as growth. When she finally responded, her tone was softer than the lights above their heads. "Systems remember the values we reward," she said. "If we reward speed, people learn to outrun conscience. If we reward dignity, people learn to slow down." He nodded once, slowly, and it felt less like agreement, and more like a vow. Lily closed the final verification window with a decisive tap, and for the first time since the afternoon began, her shoulders settled into their rightful place, not under the strain of expectation, but under the steadiness of alignment. "Parity confirmed," she said quietly, and the words sounded like a benediction. The deal would proceed, not tonight, not under pressure, but after a full review, with procedures honored and dignity restored not only to Naomi, but to every invisible client whose file had once been treated as expendable. Outside, Atlanta's skyline glittered in the early evening haze, traffic humming in steady ribbons of light that moved through the city like veins beneath skin. Inside, the bank floor felt almost sacred in its stillness. Marcus approached Naomi, his security badge catching the lamplight like a small star. "If you're ever building a team," he said, a faint, self-conscious smile tugging at his lips, "I want to be the kind of person who stands on the side of the process, before someone has to remind me to." Naomi's reply was warm, grounded. "You already took the first step," she said. "You listened when something inside you said, 'This didn't feel right.'" He exhaled, the breath sounding like release. Weeks later, a brass plaque appeared beneath the glass railing where Naomi had once sat waiting, small, unobtrusive, deliberately humble. It read, "Integrity is not a favor offered to those we recognize. It is a discipline owed to everyone." Visitors rarely noticed it at first glance, but those who did found themselves standing a little longer, thinking a little deeper, as if the building itself had learned to whisper its lesson. The bank launched an internal reform initiative not with fanfare, but with patience. Quarterly audits focused on parity across tiers, anonymous reporting channels routed beyond local management, and a mentorship track for junior employees built around one principle: precision is not privilege. Harold did not disappear in disgrace. He requested reassignment, not upward, not outward, but to a role where he could rebuild from within, where his experience could become a caution he taught, rather than a mistake he defended. Lily joined the new compliance culture task force and approached her work with a care that felt less like fear and more like reverence. The young associate stood beside her during the first staff workshop and admitted, to a room full of colleagues, that he had once trusted efficiency more than fairness, and would not do so again. Naomi did not attend the workshops. She did not need to. Her presence remained in the spaces between decisions, in the way staff paused before clicking an approval, in the way Marcus now stood not just as a guard of property, but as a guardian of dignity, and in the way clients who did not look like wealth were greeted without hesitation. 3 months later, Naomi returned on a quiet afternoon, not as an auditor, not as a test, but as a woman with time to spare and a memory to honor. She paused where the light from the windows pooled like water across the marble, reading the plaque for the first time. She did not smile. She closed her eyes, whispered a small thank you to the discipline her mother had planted in her bones, and rested one hand on the cool railing, feeling not triumph, but peace. Somewhere in the distance, a printer hummed, a clerk laughed, a door glided open to welcome another stranger without judgment, and as Naomi walked toward the exit, the city opening wide before her, the evening breeze carrying the faint sound of jazz from a nearby street, she knew that justice, when it arrives quietly, does not demand celebration. It leaves an echo, warm and steady, in the places where truth finally learned to stay.